Hello and welcome to the PRI podcast, The Responsibility of Investing. My name's Nathan Fabian, and I'm the Chief Sustainable Systems Officer of the PRI. And today we're going to talk about the UNGPs at 15, from commitment to action. So 15 years after their endorsement, the UN Guiding Principles remain the globally recognized framework for understanding business responsibility to respect human rights. But at the same time, investors are operating in an increasingly complex environment, characterized by geopolitical fragmentation, supply chain reconfiguration, rapid technological change, rising inequality, and competing sustainability priorities. So today, we're going to examine how investor practice has evolved over the past 15 years, but also what the next phase of implementation should look like in a clearly changing global context. And we're very lucky to be joined today by Elisabeth Andvig from Norges Bank Investment Management, or NBIM, as we all know them. Elisabeth brings a perspective from one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds with deep experience in stewardship and human rights across a global portfolio. And this includes significant emerging market exposure. And we're also joined by Robert Lewenson from Old Mutual. And Robert brings an asset manager's perspective with an emerging market focus, but grounded in the conversation of real UNGP implementation in emerging market contexts and also involving broader social themes. So Elisabeth and Robert, thanks both for joining us today. Why don't we start by looking at where we've come from? When the UNGPs were endorsed in 2011, human rights were often viewed as a specialist sustainability issue. Elisabeth, if we start with you, what's changed over the past 15 years?
So I haven't been in this field for the full 15 years, unfortunately, but I did start my career at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and actually working on the guiding principles in their team on business and human rights and doing the policy work there. And I remember when I started this in about 2015, if you raise the topic of the UN Guiding Principles with a general company, just whichever out there, it wasn't necessarily a very familiar topic. They might have heard about it, maybe in the background, but it wasn't really necessarily a core business kind of tool. I think since then, I've very much seen an evolution in the conversations that we're having with companies where the UN Guiding Principles are familiar to most companies these days, at least the biggest ones, the ones that are listed, the ones that we engage with from NBIM's perspective. And a lot of companies have human rights policies. They know the concept of human rights due diligence. They know kind of what we're asking for when we raise these very key concepts, which at the time were a little bit confusing. But I think what is good and what the John Ruggie team did quite well back in the day when they were developing the UNGPs was to very much use business concepts that are somewhat familiar and then weave them into the human rights field as well and make sure that those things were somewhat interwoven. So I'm definitely seeing the familiarity, the awareness. We've gone past the time where doing human rights was mainly about child labor and where it's actually more broad in terms of the sectors and the context in which people would actually refer to human rights impacts by business operators.
From my side, unfortunately, much with every global standard and in its adoption, it often takes a major crisis for the spotlight to really shine onto the principles in terms of why they are there in the first place. And I recall the same time as the principles were endorsed, we started to see real social issues present themselves around supply chains, around human rights in communities, particularly in mining companies here in South Africa. And what we saw was almost a very tragic event, which ultimately not only destroyed livelihoods of the people involved and surrounding communities, but it actually destroyed the company as well. And, the fact is that we saw a sharp focus then on, okay, well, was this an isolated incident or was it more of a systemic issue in the mining sector? For me, that really just put the spotlight right directly onto how do we obtain real redress, or not just try and deal with the issues after the fact, but how do we prevent these issues from coming about in the first place? And that was kind of the hardest learning. I don't think we are there yet, and by no means, and I think we've still got plenty to learn in this particular area. But we did need a framework, and we did really test that framework to see how it's evolved, to see its adoption, and ultimately its implementation.
Our reporting data indicates that 70% of our signatories have some form of human rights policy, but only 7% act on all three parts of policy commitment, due diligence, and access to remedy. So, Rob, when you're talking about wide implementation, are you talking about all dimensions of implementing the UNGPs?
I'd like to say yes, but actually, if we just look at the basic pillar, never mind, adherence or even scratching at the surface of due diligence. Due diligence is due diligence is due diligence. I've been listening to a number of podcasts from PRI and via the advanced framework about the rights and responsibilities of investors and how far they extend down the supply chain. And, what really seems to be of interest, and this is coming from, I think, the Danish Human Rights Institute, where they have a very interesting understanding of what the concept of due diligence means, both upstream and downstream, and how investors are expected, I guess, to respond in those circumstances. So that is still evolving to a large extent.
So let's focus on the due diligence perspective. Elisabeth, what's your experience? What's the difficult parts on the due diligence? What kind of methods are you using?
So I think one reflection I also had when Rob was speaking is that we've maybe moved a little bit away from the reactive parts to the more proactive side of things. Like one thing is to respond to specific incidents and really look at kind of things happening on the ground, which then also might become a little bit imbalanced because in certain areas or contexts, you might have more things that are properly documented than in others. There are still a lot of spaces out there that are a little bit black holes when it comes to actually seeing what's going on the ground. With regards to like the concrete due diligence and operationalization of it, where you're expected to actually identify your material risks and really address those as you are looking at whether it's from the investor perspective, your portfolio, but also from a company perspective, like you're actually doing the process of identifying and mitigating any potential or actual adverse impacts. I think we still have a way to go to actually make sure that it's properly integrated, that there is a real system around it. But we are definitely getting there. There is a lot of information out there about specific sectors and industries, what types of risks are evolving around the work that they're doing, and also then how they should be trying to act to make sure that it doesn't lead to any increased risks down the line. I'm thinking and I'm seeing a little bit of that movement, like from reacting to specific incidents to rather proactively going out and having conversations around the systems in place, risk management. And I think that's also where we're maybe moving a little bit more in the investor space to really seeing the financial materiality of this when you haven't managed your risks properly. I think that's where a lot of good arguments come in, is where we say if the companies don't have good processes in place from the outset, this might lead to higher risk further down the line. So let's make sure to get in there early to have those policies in place, but also to make sure that the processes are there to identify risks before they happen, before there is a scandal. Like Rob was saying earlier on, the scandals might be the ones leading to certain companies having very progressive policies, very good processes in place. But it's unfortunate to have to wait for the scandal, or it's even terrible and tragic when it happens that you don't have the real processes in place so that you could have actually prevented things from happening in the first place. So as I was mentioning, a lot of good organizations, as Rob mentioned, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, are doing a lot of work to really facilitate for companies to see what good looks like in terms of due diligence, also within specific sectors and industries, also when it comes to specific stakeholders, that being children or indigenous peoples or other more vulnerable communities, and really making sure that it's implementable, it's practical, and it's not rocket science for a company to understand how it should be done. Though I will say, if we're talking about due diligence from an investor perspective, when you have a portfolio of about 8,000 companies, to really do the proactive due diligence to screen everyone for any types of risks that might be involved in terms of their geographic operations or the sectors and industries that they're operating in. It's still a challenge, but I do think with a lot of the emerging tools that we have available, and at MBM, we really use artificial intelligence very proactively. I'm seeing a lot of potential for really building out quite strong due diligence systems also at the investor level, even if you are as large and diverse as we are.
So what's your satisfaction level, both of you, when you think about those companies, whether it's a wide public portfolio or it's a bit more concentrated? Are the companies' due diligence processes, their engagement methods they're using, are they sufficient to give you some confidence on this preemptive approach? Obviously, that's our objective. Where are the companies up to?
So I'm actually feeling a little less confident than Elisabeth here, because as much as I would love to have a very clear sight, and yes, technology has advanced to a point where anything that picks up anywhere, we can pretty much tag and see. And I agree with that completely. It puts us in a far better position than we were 5 years ago, even, to actually do our work properly. I'm still seeing a lot of problems. My concern is policy and retrograde efforts to perhaps dilute some of those abilities to ask the right questions.
I hear you as well. And I think sometimes it's really hard also sitting in a gilded office in Oslo and really know what's actually happening on the ground. And of course, companies are quite good at providing extensive reporting and showing that they're doing certain things, have policies in place, etc. But of course, we're all still seeing that there are negative outcomes. I will say there is a huge discrepancy between companies. Some are exposed to certain topics where there's been a lot of development over the years and where there's quite high maturity. Then, of course, there are other issues where it's kind of maybe easier to get away with things and not doing things responsibly. I think what I am a little bit worried about these days, particularly, I also see the point about policy regressing. Some of these developments that we had maybe 3-4 years ago, where we were seeing mandatory human rights due diligence being integrated in various legislations and jurisdictions, that is kind of being watered out on the basis of various, interests coming to the forefront. And I'm also worried about the stakeholders that we rely on so significantly to get information out and to actually understand beyond the corporate reporting that their funding base is being completely undermined, that they're not getting the support they needed. And I think we've seen that over the years. We rely on journalists, we rely on civil society organizations, we rely on UN organizations to do all the documenting, to really put the information out there so that we also have the information to hold companies accountable, and not just us from the investor perspective, but everyone else. If they don't have the money, the funding, the support to actually continue to do that work and are increasingly under threat, then I really worry about what this landscape will look like moving forward.
Rob, what types of policy changes are you talking about, just to be clear?
I mean, very simply, a mandatory disclosures. How long has it taken for TISFD to come through as a framework? I think it's a fantastic framework, but there's no obligation to report in terms of that. We've kind of seen a maturity in the climate space to a point where it is financial accounting standard. We don't see the same thing on the human rights side at this stage. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon either.
We have this very layered, structured view about being responsible investors, where we set policies, we seek disclosure, verifying it, having active ownership engagement, and then making better risk return and impact related investment decisions. But in this world where we've got all these external challenges and this disruption through these very important stakeholder engagement ideas around due diligence, is that implementation model even going to support us? Do we need to really innovate? How do we think about where we're up to on this implementation now?
Yeah, I think we must be a little bit careful about painting too bleak of a picture as well, because I think that's been the job of human rights activists for centuries, right? It is important that we continue to keep our eye on the ball. human rights are universal. There are important frameworks. They came about because of a massive crisis in the world. So really, let's not forget how extremely important that is. But I would also say if we go back to 2011, where there was then the development of the guiding principles at the time, most CEOs running a company didn't really think about human rights as an issue. That wasn't really relevant. You run your business, the business of business is business, as some maybe said at the back at the time, and then you kind of went about doing that. And then came this framework, which was very much then considered a soft law framework, but all states were supporting it. And it was, of course, in line with what they had been adopting in terms of conventions, etc. And then we've kind of slowly moved into more hard law instruments. You have it sometimes sitting in sustainability departments in companies, sometimes in compliance because it has been developed into regulatory frameworks. And we're seeing expertise in companies where a lot of very, expert, highly capable people are sitting in these sustainability departments in these companies these days and actually trying to do the work, although you might feel like it's getting more difficult. But if we look back 15 years, these people weren't even there. They weren't doing this work necessarily. So I see that there is a very, volatile environment around us, and we have kind of maybe a lack of leadership in certain spaces. But I'm also going into conversations with board members and kind of asking a little bit of questions around how are you seeing the landscape, the geopolitics, supply chain disruptions. And I'm hearing quite a few board members in large listed companies who are very much, focused on these things. They are somewhat worried about certain developments, but they also know a lot more about these topics, I think, these days than maybe they did before. Like they maybe have these sustainability departments reporting directly to them, sharing a little bit of the concerns, what they're doing maybe to operationalize and maybe shift a little bit their supply chain depending a bit on the regulatory frameworks or things that are happening in certain areas. But we're also seeing, I think if we're talking about the policy space, what I've been following a little bit with high interest is in Southeast Asia, you actually have now mandatory human rights due diligence emerging. You have new trade agreements where forced labor is being very much put on the agenda. It might not be for the same interests everywhere, but I do think, we should take the small wins where we can find them and really try to use those to the best of our ability, because we've discussed this quite a bit with, my human rights community more broadly. And I went to the UN Business and Human Rights Forum in November, and it felt very much like a large therapy sessions. A lot of people were extremely worried about these developments, but I also spoke to some people who were just like, but remember where we came from, remember where we were. We were very much sitting in the back. No one really wanted to listen to us. So like today, we actually have a lot more access. Like even if I look at the investor side of things, you have highly capable human rights people who now might be sitting at the core of some of these conversations with companies or with management, or like shaping, strategies within these institutions, which is important because you have to bring that perspective to the table. And I don't think I wasn't there 15 years ago, but I really don't think that was the case before.
Yeah, thanks, Elisabeth. Very good. So, Rob, last couple of times you've reacted to Elisabeth, you've done sort of a logical negative view of this, of the same context. What do you think on Elisabeth's view of the sort of the net progress and the greater capacity of the system now?
I will say this is another clear sign of good progress. In South Africa, we've got a terminology, and maybe it's not ours, but it's used quite commonly, called a social license to operate. That's been used 15 years ago. Maybe it had a very niche meaning in a certain mining sector, perhaps, where, there was agreed undertaking to transform certain industries in terms of its diversity. Social license to operate has become far more mainstream, and it's become more cross multi-sector. In the past, it used to be a lot to do with doing business with the government at the time. That has now evolved to doing business with consumers to show that, in fact, they have that social license to operate, that they are caring about issues of human rights more broadly, but in addition are acting more like responsible corporate citizens as a result. And I think that's also given those companies that have taken that on that challenge, because it is a challenge. It's not, if you don't have to do it, and really not necessarily an incentive to do so. But companies who have really given it thought to are managing their sustainability risks and seen opportunities. Having a social license to operate is one of those key opportunities, because you get to access the broader market, or you get to access better consumers, or you access global capital more effectively, or any other positive elements. So seeing that playing out in real time and seeing more companies taking on that challenge of a social license to operate, I think that's been a massive change in the last 15 years from where we were.
Why don't we circle back to this idea of access to remedy, which is where the UNGPs rubber hits the road in a way. It makes it, I think it stands out the human rights area from some of the other areas of responsible investment. So where do you think we're really up to? Even if these companies are protecting their license to operate or know the importance of that, how effective is the system working on access to remedy?
The system is an easy way to disguise the real problem, and it is a multi-layered issue. Obviously, you need to look at what's available in terms of the legal frameworks in the specific jurisdictions for anyone who suffers under specific human rights controversy. Often those aren't available, and equal access under the law isn't available. And again, I'm trying not to be in too much of a negative bent, but it's a reality for millions of people. So, and also if you look at what, legal frameworks and how they've developed in terms of protecting these issues, only in certain areas are they advanced to a point where financial gain as a result, or redress as a result of harm caused, is well enough developed to make that causal link to underlying person who was harmed. That's a big challenge at a societal level. And I think very few who say, well, we can make that happen. I think that feels like it's a big tide to swim against. But you can be a policy advocate and create a cohort of like-minded individuals to really work on changing legal constructs in certain areas. The issue is then ultimately, if that doesn't support, what do you do? Where do you go? How do you offer access in a way that isn't necessarily supported by this government or the area in which you live? And then you look at you look to what the corporates are doing, how they offer certain areas of remedy, like even having a whistleblower hotline, or looking to categorize certain insurance in respect of certain risks that arise, or etc. Extending the ambit of redress to the workforce, to their stakeholders. Perhaps that's more of an opportunity to say that you're committed to that particular element. And from what I see from the stats, Nathan, it's a very small percentage who have made that particular, or are implementing that particular pillar of their UNGPs.
Indeed, it is. But thank you for setting out some of the constructive ways to act. Elisabeth, what's some of your experiences around trying to address this?
So I might just go back to kind of the UN guiding principles and the structure, which I think is maybe also a little bit where this becomes challenging, because you have the first pillar, which is about the state responsibility to protect. You have the second pillar, which is the business responsibility to respect. And then you have the access to remedy. And somehow that can lead to an interpretation that it kind of sits separate and is not actually part of the first two. And of course, it very squarely sits in both buckets. It is the forgotten pillar of the guiding principles. That was the case 10 years ago. It remains the case today, I think, unfortunately, for companies and especially also for investors. It is uncomfortable to, acknowledge that harm might have occurred as a result of certain activities that one might be linked to. And it's also very uncomfortable for a company that is used to maybe dealing with impacts related to corruption or other things that might very squarely fit within legal compliance, where you don't want to acknowledge that you've actually taken part in anything that might be illegal or unfortunate. So I think we still have a big way to go in terms of awareness raising, recognition, and also then what do you do? Like as an investor, one feels maybe very far away from this potential harm as well. But we can't forget that we can still try to use our leverage to make sure that we raise that awareness, and that we also kind of encourage all our companies to either collaborate or have mechanisms in place themselves. I think it is really difficult because a lot of the people who are affected aren't necessarily the strong actors out there. It is costly to raise complaints. The judicial systems are very slow. It takes time, and very often you will stand up against an actor that has a lot of resources available to really make their case heard. Access to remedy, it's a difficult one because, of course, we're talking a little bit about like the proactive pieces of things, doing your due diligence, reacting, taking mitigating measures. But even if you take and follow that route, what might have already happened is still your responsibility to repair and actually fix. But I feel like very often it becomes a forward-looking thing rather than also looking at what has already occurred, unless there are effective judicial systems really picking up on it. So we see certain companies being taken into various court cases where there is actually a functioning system and state framework that is taking this accountability perspective quite importantly. But I think those are the rare cases, and very often harm will occur, and then there isn't necessarily that reparation at the end of it.
All right. Well, thanks both for setting out your thinking and some of the steps that can be taken. Clearly, it's an area we're going to have to keep working together on. But of course, there are other emerging trends that are of interest to our investor community, and especially we move into this very competitive phase of international economic development. And so investors are thinking about the risks and opportunities of economic inequality, I'd say more. We're hearing this from signatories, and there's a lot more case studies available on this these days. And we'll be digging into the issues further at a dedicated session at PRI Person in October to explore some of those case studies. And Rob's already said that the TISFD is helping to provide a framework so we can think about these social dimensions with a bit more sophistication and comparable data, which is excellent. So the investor interest is clearly there. But Rob, if we come to you first, how would you say human rights considerations connect with these broader questions of inequality and economic inclusion as we're trying to navigate this competitive transition phase of our global economy?
They work hand in hand. And, it comes down to the broader issue of what the transition, whether it's just, it's been used so many times in so many places, and it's been typically isolated to the coal mining industry. Because coal's dirty, we want to get rid of coal, or maybe even extend that a little into the fossil fuel space. And that goes very squarely into the point that you've just made, Nathan, around the link to economic inequality. Even further than that, and this is where we get into new territory, is actually, regarding the minerals and resources that are going to be necessary to drive the transition. Those minerals and resources exist in places where practices around and where opportunities to earn an income are not necessarily a whole lot of other options available. And this idea of greenwashing our transition is starting to gain a lot of traction in terms of actually, it's all very well to say the end product is net zero aligned or whatever it is, but the social issues that it's caused in terms of getting to that manufactured point shows how economic inequality can show up. Because your end user is perhaps well resourced and be able to use it and be able to clean up their own act, but it actually hasn't made any difference for those people on the ground who are still sitting in the same social inequality that they had prior, whether the transition had ramped up or not.
Human rights obviously provides a framework for us to understand some of the social good questions around communities and economic transition, but I'm wondering if we're using our risk return frameworks as investors, that there are increasing tensions there. There will be some economic losses through transition in different sectors. And so there are additional costs potentially of dealing with the social dimensions of economic transition as well as the environmental dimensions and those questions. So does being a risk return investor and a human rights aware investor, does that give you the full toolkit you need to navigate these things, or are there trade-offs that you think we're just really going to struggle to resolve?
Perhaps in an area where you don't have the same kind of benefits as any other employee, or either as a contractor. If we go into a workforce that may look very different 5 years from now, and we're looking at where skills and skills transfer lies, where perhaps professionals using specific tools who are adept in doing so, and there are others who will never get to that level of evolution in their skills development and training. I think we need to look really at like as much grassroots level as possible here. I think that risk return is the right framework, yeah. But we had risk return and impact for quite a while as taken away from modern portfolio theory, and I don't think we must lose that sight of that. I think we are here. We do have a fiduciary duty to our investors, and we do everything else. Part and parcel of that is to ensure that we do so responsibly. It's just not a separate. It shouldn't be seen as a separate wing of investment theory as it perhaps it has been.
I think there is a very challenging mind shift there always when you're talking about human rights in the context of investment or business operations, where we're talking about risks to people and not risks to business. And I think I'm not sure we've actually managed to actually get all the way there to make sure that that thinking is fully integrated. I do think though, and especially like from our perspective, we really take the long-term view, like we're a long-term investor. We therefore then would benefit from a decrease in economic inequalities, from well-functioning economies, from actually a planet that is sustainable, where we can still, operate and make sure we're here for future generations. So making those very short-term decisions at the cost of the more long-term development is not something that anyone would benefit from, especially not if you're a long-term investor. So I do think it's important to see the full picture, to really also see the intersection between people, nature, climate, make sure we're bridging all those things together, and then look at the risk also for like the sustainability of your business and your activity in the long term. If you take the shortcuts now, and if you don't have the license to operate, you're not providing those opportunities for the people in the communities in which you actually choose to do certain projects or otherwise. I don't think that those companies are the ones who are going to be here in the next 50 years. So ideally, we would see the ones actually taking that proactive approach and really making sure they are more precautionary than just like the short-term gains for the tomorrow, because we want to see them there in the 5-10 years moving forward and not just in the tomorrow.
Thank you. And mining is an interesting example here where we think about new high demand minerals, for example. And so, Rob, thinking about your South African experience, where that mining industry has been central to the jobs that are there, but maybe there's really high demand and also high scrutiny on supply chains for, say, fueling our future electrified economy. So there is some opportunity here as well in the way we establish our new supply chains. Do you think we're ready to work into that with expectations that can be built in to help our communities transition and to deal with some of the distribution issues that arise around this massive economic shift we're going to go through?
I think there's huge opportunity, Nathan, and specifically in education, just to bring people to a point of understanding their role in terms of a broader transition in our economy, and not fearing it as being one that they are going to lose their job as a result. I think that in of itself, well, it does go a long way for our communities to buy into being part of this, as opposed to it's going to happen and we're going to be kicked out. I think that's a huge element of it, and meaningful education as well. I think if you help people understand how valuable the land is under their feet and the value of their job in extracting that material and where it's going to go and how it's going to benefit their children and grandchildren of all, you can try and dispel that age-old argument about my lungs might not be clear, but my belly is empty. And then, that kind of thinking, has been absolutely prevalent until such time as people who are at the lowest social strata are helped to understand what they are going to do is how it's going to benefit their children and grandchildren. I would also add a couple of points here around, we get into a point where mining is again having a heyday. And, we've seen astronomical prices increase in the price of commodities that unlikely to, long term, these minerals are critical and will be used and will remain with elevated pricing and such. And I often think about, what does that mean? Are companies going to maintain the same level of discipline around their supply chains rather than to get everything out as quickly as possible in the most efficient way in order to extract the most profit? To Elisabeth's point about long-term picture here, we need a very responsible, systematic, and well policy approved kind of approach to ensuring that we get the resources to the places where they need it. Where we see opposite is, where it perhaps encourages alternative, unscrupulous kind of development of extractive industries. We see perhaps hoarding of critical minerals, everything that says, okay, well, let me just deal with what I have right now in order to get my immediate gain, versus let's see what you're doing in terms of being a cog in a wheel of a much bigger plan to fully transition our world away from what we've been doing for the last 200 years and working towards where we can actually set ourselves up properly for the next 200. And we haven't even properly contemplated what that looks like. Some may think of it in theoretical terms, but it's something that I'm thinking about often, and I don't see a immediate obvious solution that's coming out in literature or any thought process. I'm not unique in this way. I'm very to these conversations with many other people, but it's one that fascinates me, it excites me. But I also really want to see it actually take place in a responsible way.
Yeah, I think we need to kind of remember why the UNGPs and these frameworks were developed in the first place. We don't want to see those situations, I think, a bit like Rob was alluding to, where, certain companies just come in and then do whatever they need, extract resources, leave lots of damage behind and have no accountability for what they've done. Let's just hope that all these like principles and values and frameworks and rules and regulations aren't just completely thrown out the window. I do think we're maybe operating in a little bit of a divided world at the moment, and maybe that's a little bit of the challenge. But I also think if you're talking to people about like the real life impact, about the people behind it, and about all the value that you can bring to society and to everyone, if you're just bringing people along, if you are laying the groundwork in the proper way to make sure that these opportunities don't benefit the very few, but actually the broader, which would lead to more resilience and development in the long term. I think this view of like, there's just one cake, and if you take one piece, then there's not going to be anything left for anyone else, is a little bit old school. I think if you actually bring something that will grow and be prosperous, then there are more people who could benefit. You just need to be a little bit less selfish and actually think about it as an investment that should actually grow something meaningful for everyone. We're here also talking about the just transition because we realize that climate change impacts us all. There aren't like walls and separations between whatever one country emits versus the other. So it needs to be a collaborative effort. It doesn't really work if there's only the very few that are benefiting from it because no one lives in that very isolated bubble. I think that goes for conflict, it goes for climate, it goes for nature. If we're undermining our biodiversity system as well, we as humans and everyone else around us will be suffering. So I really feel like having the long-term perspective is the most helpful perspective to have. But then let's just make sure that we keep on reminding everyone about that.
I think it's also good to focus on the winners. and those that are doing things really well, because and almost celebrate them, and also give them a chance to take a leadership role for the rest of their sector. So, for example, via PRI Advance, where we have seen a real transformation happen at a company on a specific issue, whether it be ASM or any kind of human rights related topic, then we encourage them to actually take that position more broadly and become a leader in either in the industry body. If they found something that works, then why not let it go to the broader sector and be of benefits to society as a whole, rather than just, for their own scorecard on sustainability or whatever it is. I think that for me is a real opportunity, and I think that's where PRI and Advance kind of shine the spotlight on those companies to really get them to give them the credit that they deserve and be able to show up amongst their peers as being a leader in this space.
So if we were coming back in 5 years' time for the 20th anniversary of the UNGPs, what do you think might be the one or two things that we as investors could or will have done to have made a difference to advance their implementation? What do you think will be the key things we contribute over the next 5 years?
Really focusing on the good practices and making sure that we are bringing everyone along. Like, I'm finding it super interesting, some of the conversations that I'm having with the less leading, less large and scrutinized companies, where you can come up with like small ideas for small changes, and they will be very happy to take those on board and do things that can actually be very impactful. I think we need to also think that the landscape out there is the large companies, but it's also the small and medium-sized enterprises, where there could be innovation and there could be the small things that can actually make a huge impact for people in the long term. So maybe it's a bit about seeing the diversity of everything that's out there, bringing everyone along, understanding there is no one size fits all necessarily, but that the key kind of objective should be do no harm and contribute to the more positive developments out there. Maybe recognizing that, and then hopefully, I'm hoping that in 5 years' time, there will be a little bit more recognition and awareness around the access to remedy piece, that it's not just sensitive, but that it's actually also where you can maybe bring the leaders of the pack in and show that if you do things well also in that area, that is more sustainable and resilient in the long term, not just reacting, but also, repairing and compensating and doing what is right at the end of the day, because no one is benefiting from people suffering in your kind of trail.
5 years from now, wow. Okay, a lot can happen in 5 years. I would say one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a lot now at the moment as well is what about the human and human rights? And, how much are we going to see a real focus on the rights of humans to be able to be economically active? I think that for me is going to be a massive, and I wonder if UNGP's principles could apply to and do apply to a situation where that world is being rapidly disrupted. I would like to think so, and I would almost say that it might be I'm not saying to tee up anyone, but might be worth having a look again at the principles and seeing that they remain future fit for the next 5 years.
Thank you both. This is a session that I know our responsible investment community will have really enjoyed and benefited from. So thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you, Rob, for joining us. We look forward to working with you in the months ahead, including at our events for signatories and hopefully seeing you at PRI in person. And thank you to all of you, our listeners. We'll see you next time.